Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to give everyone a few minutes to join before we get started. I'll aim to get started around 12:03 because we have quite the jam-packed session in store. But while we're waiting for everyone to join, we have got a poll here for you to answer. So I'm going to launch that now. The panelists and I are a little curious to know a little more about how you feel about remote proctoring today. So please go ahead and share your thoughts as you're getting settled in, and I will share the results with you before we dive in. Great, lots of you answering the poll, more than half. Appreciate that. Once again, if you are just joining us, we're going to get started at around 12:03, but in the meantime, please get settled in and take a look at the poll we've launched. We're trying to get a sense of how you feel about remote proctoring today. "75% of you have answered so far, which I really appreciate. You'll notice that there's not really a neutral option on here, so we're really trying to force you to make a decision. All right, we're at 12:03, so I'm going to stop the poll. 82% of you have participated. And I don't know if it's a surprise or not, but most of you have a pretty positive feel toward remote proctoring overall. Either you love it or the benefits outweigh the challenges. So I think that's really helpful for us to know, kind of migrating into the webinar today. So thank you so much. Okay, well, we're going to get started. So welcome, everyone. My name is Sandy Hogue. I'm the Manager of Business Development at ITS, and I will be your host and moderator during today's webinar. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate your time and your company. We've got a great session lined up today with an impressive panel where we'll be trying to touch on all areas of security considerations for remote proctored exams. So we're hoping that you leave with, some new ideas and a rounded perspective on securing these exams before, during, and after test day. And that's also how we try to group our questions as well to make sure that we're addressing this topic holistically. This will be a panel style webinar, so for the majority of the time, it'll just be me and the panelists on screen talking. Before we jump in, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we have reserved some dedicated time at the end of this webinar for Q&A, but that said, we're not going to be just ignoring any questions that are submitted during the webinar as a rule or anything. So, if something that one of our guests says does inspire a question that makes more sense in context, please do go ahead and submit it using that Q&A button in your Zoom interface, and we'll try to work it in as time allows. This webinar will be recorded, so we'll share the link to access that after the webinar has ended. You'll get an email. And there will also be a survey at the end that will appear in your Zoom window. So please don't click away too quickly. We'd love to hear your feedback about your thoughts on today's webinar, as well as suggestions for future topics. All right, so without any further delay, I am going to ask today's panelists to join and introduce themselves. All right, everyone's very prompt. So I'm going to start with Pete. I'll ask you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'm wondering if you'll also share a bit about what you're currently focused on and sort of what's top of mind for you from a security standpoint in just a few words.
Thank you, Sandy. My name is Pete Van Dyke. I've been working in certification for 15 years. I'm a security program manager at Amazon with their certification program. Spent the last 3.5 years doing that, and I divide my time currently between people that steal our content and publish it on brain dump websites, proxy testers, and those that misbehave on individual exams.
Great, thank you so much. Harry, why don't you go next?
Hi, I'm Harry Samet. I am the Director of Special Investigations for Pearson VUE. I've been in certifications and assessment for about 3 years. Prior to that, I spent 21 years as a special agent in the FBI, and then before that, 9 years as a naval intelligence officer. My typical day-to-day is using the techniques I learned in those past professions to figure out what happened when there's an incident, a crisis, misconduct of some nature on an exam, either discovered in advance, during the exam, or after the exam. The team that I work with, we try and figure out what happened and who is responsible.
Great, thank you. John, how about you?
Thanks, Andy. My name is John Jensen. I'm the Senior Vice President of Product Management at Examity. I've been in the industry for just a couple of years, so a relative newcomer, but I've been in the software and technology space for over 20 years. So really fun. My role is really thinking about how to make our software work better. And that's a challenge because I'm trying to balance the needs of our test takers and making sure that they have a smooth and seamless experience, while also making sure that we are enforcing the rules of the program and making sure that the exam is a fair experience for everybody. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks for joining us. And last but not least, Chris.
Hi. Thanks, Sandy. My name's Chris Glacken. I'm Director of Innovative Technologies at ITS. I've been in the assessment industry for about 9 years now, and my main focus is on building out our secure browsers, our lockdown browsers for the Windows and Mac platforms, as well as building out our ITS Proctor Now remote proctoring product.
Great. Awesome. You guys have such a wide range of experience, so I'm really excited to dive in here. I'd like to start with a sort of an introductory high-level question. So we're talking about, defending ourselves against, defending ourselves in a remote proctoring scenario. So I'm curious about, the enemies that we're defending against, right? So what motivations could a bad actor have during a remotely proctored exam? I'd like to start with Harry.
So in terms of motivation, I think the obvious one, and the one that we see most often, probably the vast majority of bad actors, is going to be financial. Like any criminal, the folks who seek to hack or steal intellectual property, to do all the sorts of things they do to impact an exam program, they're doing it to make money. It's a pretty lucrative business out there, depending on the desirability and the potential for changing the path of someone's life of a certification. The bad guys stand to make a substantial profit from influence an exam, the course of an exam. There are two other motivations we've detected, and they're rare enough that it's a surprise when they happen. One of them is altruism. One of them is people will often steal intellectual property because they think they're helping other candidates. They don't intend to sell it. They don't intend to profit financially from it, but they think they're helping their colleagues or their co-travelers in that space. And then the other kind that is probably the rarest, fortunately, is educational misconduct, where an instructor will actually, someone who is responsible for doing training will actually steal content because it's easier to do that rather than actually teaching his students, the materials that they need to pass the exam.
Oh, interesting. All right, so money, altruism, and educational misconduct. I'm going to go over to Pete and see, do you have anything to add to that list or expand upon?
Well, on the financial side, just in the IT exam universe, it's estimated that proxy testing is a multi-$100 million business annually. So, the organizations that are doing this are very sophisticated, very motivated, and it's a very lucrative business for them. So this isn't going away anytime soon.
And could you define proxy testing just for the audience in case there's someone who doesn't know what that means here?
Sure. Proxy testing is when an individual or an organization offers to take an exam for a candidate for a fee. And we see a wide variety of fees for this on the IT side. It's not unusual for fees of between $250 and $2,000 for a proxy exam. So if somebody doesn't feel confident enough, or if they've got some other motivation, I need to have this certification in order to keep my job, as an example. There are plenty of people out there that are willing to take a test, usually through remote control of a computer, and that's known as proxy testing.
Wow, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, so now that we've set the stage a little bit, I'd like to move into thinking about, some things that need to happen prior to a candidate sitting down to take a test, maybe during sort of the design phase of an exam or a form. First question here is, what should programs be thinking about as they are designing and planning for an exam that they'd like to be remote proctored? For example, what are some industry best practices for securing those remotely proctored exams? I'm going to start with Chris. I'm curious for your perspective on this.
Sure. So I think with regards to that question, three things really jump out at me when I think about that. The things that you want to be thinking about are what level of security you're going to want to implement. What do you want the examining experience to be? And what kind of resources do you have to implement everything? So I think all three of those put together are really going to put you in a spot where you end up with whatever solution that you're going to go for. So during that process, you're going to want to ask yourself things like, how well do you trust your candidates, and what are the penalties for cheating? A penalty like being banned from a profession for life is going to be a lot more severe than a more lower stakes college course that isn't going to have something like that, and they can go turn around and take the test or move into another course. So those are factors that come into play. And you need to ask yourself things like, what is your plan if you get content exposure, and are you even okay with the possibility of having content exposure delivering through remote, because that is a possibility. You need to think through the processes that you're going to have for violations and potential misconduct, and also the possibility of misconduct. So what are you going to do if it's not 100% certain? Because most of the time it's probably not going to be, or be able to 100% prove it without a doubt. So those are things that you're all going to want to think of. With regards to best practices, you're going to want to look at things like, definitely a lockdown browser is a must-have. It should not be the only thing you have, but it should be one of those levels that you have within your security. 2-camera, room scans, verifying the candidate, and those type of things as well.
Thank you, Chris. Harry, curious if you have anything to add to this in terms of best practices.
I do. So we think of exam security for, frankly, for in-person or remotely proctored exams as a 360-degree endeavor, by which we mean before, during, and after the exam. Best practices, as Chris said, really depend on the appetite for risk, the threat that the exam sponsor is facing. But prior to the exam, that incorporates things like exam design, how the content is presented, and security features inherent in the design of the test itself. During the exam, it incorporates things like Chris said, like the secure browser, greeter and proctor training, steps that the exam provider and the exam delivery mechanism use to keep the exam secure while the candidate is in the hot seat. And then the final phase, the after, is really where my team comes in most often, although we certainly dabble in all three arenas. and that is when misconduct or the possibility of misconduct is detected, we step in and then conduct a thorough investigation to find out what happened. And to Chris's point, there are very few black and whites in the exam security world. It's not generally simple to be able to say, okay, we understand with complete clarity what happened, and we can give you a blow by blow. There are some ambiguities here, and that's where experience and corporate knowledge and understanding the threat, what the bad guys do and how they operate, that's where that all comes together.
So 360-degree endeavor. I think that's helpful to think of it that way. All right, so next I'd like I'm curious about how much information you share with the end users, the candidates, to prepare for testing. How do you set expectations with them? And is there a risk of giving too much information away in that sort of candidate preparation that might aid bad actors or those who wish to misbehave? I'm going to start with Pete.
Thank you. Well, we at Amazon try to be as transparent as possible as far as what kind of behaviors will result in an invalidation of an exam or perhaps banning from a program. So we do this in multiple ways and multiple spaces, including a checklist that has to be attested to right before launch of a proctored exam. So we tell them that you can't leave the webcam view, you can't lean partially off screen, you can't have a third party, you can't access an electronic device or cell phone, those types of things. What we've found is that you can't deliver this information frequently enough. As you probably know, if you've ever taken one of these exams, you're nervous, you're skipping over things that say click here to continue. So even if we put it 10 times, the chances of people skipping over 10 times are pretty frequent. Now, what we do slightly differently, we inform our candidates that we use data forensics after the fact to look at score similarities and other categories. We are not entirely transparent on what it is that we look for with data forensics, because that would allow people an edge and give them a way to misbehave without detection. So while we do talk about the fact that we're using these tools and what the sanctions are for them, we don't specify what exactly we do with data forensics.
Yeah, you don't want to give all that away. All right, great. I'm curious, John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, one of the things that's always a challenge for our program is to make sure that you're clearly communicating the rules and expectations during the exam. And just like Pete said, people don't like to read. So one of the biggest challenges is how to distill what really matters into a short and consumable set of rules to help test takers really understand. So we definitely continue to repeat and refresh test takers, keep them in every notification that we can, helping them understand that there are rules, you should pay attention to them. But from the program's perspective, make sure that, like Chris said earlier, that you've thought about kind of end to end what rules are really impactful, and make sure that you're enforcing those with your proctoring provider, but also make sure that you're not making it overly complicated. You have a lot of flexibility with different platforms and what you can do, but make sure you have a plan ahead of time for what you should do, what really matters. Things like if a child walks into the room or not, if a pet walks into the room or not, like some of those things can be really disruptive potentially in a remote testing environment. We all don't have the same control of our environment as you do in the test center. So you've got to think about what really is going to matter to your program and what's not. And that comes down to your assessment of the risk, how it impacts the program, and how it impacts the experience of the person taking the test.
Great, thanks. Harry, you have your hand up. You have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it's an interesting question how much information is shared with test takers, with candidates. That's a good one, because it's always a balance, right? When taking action to remediate misconduct, exam sponsors want to be able to tell the candidate, we got you dead to rights and here's why. Obviously, the biggest motivation for that is to forestall any legal action or any, the candidate taking any steps to, publicly defame the exam sponsor. But the reality is, as that information is shared, these techniques spread through the illicit testing community. And so the bad guys learn more and more about how we do business. And so a very famous icon in the testing industry, one that I was presenting with at a conference, once said, in language I understood, candidates are not entitled to due process, right? This isn't a criminal proceeding, and so we don't have to tell them every piece of evidence that we used and how we obtained it before we take action. And so that's a great thing to remember, right? We, as a security practitioner, I want to share much less typically than usual, because I don't want them to know how we do business.
Right. So then that's an interesting question, is like, how much evidence is enough to share with them that, like, we've got you, we know it, but without kind of giving too much away.
And of course, the candidate knows, right? I mean, they have guilty knowledge, so they know.
Right.
So, for all of the posturing and the lawsuits that I've seen threatened in the 3 years that I'm here, that I've been here in this industry, I have yet to see a candidate actually sue, an exam provider, especially when they know the evidence is ample, even if it hasn't been explained to them.
That's definitely good to keep in mind. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We're going to shift a little bit into, when the candidate's in the hot seat, to use Harry's words, sort of during the testing, some security tactics or some things to be thinking about. So one important thing that we talk about here is balancing user experience with security, right? This is something that I think everyone who's delivering a remotely proctored exam is trying to do. So what are some factors to consider when setting that balance? I'd like to start with John.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot that goes into that. And when you think about the design of a platform or a tool set, the hard work is in making a complicated process like checking in and taking an exam be simple and easy for the test taker. So when we think about the user experience, there's a couple of key motivations. One is, how do we get the test taker into the hot seat as quickly as possible? How do we make sure that they understand exactly what they're going to encounter along the way? So for example, if there's an ID check, they're expected to present a government issued ID part along the way. We need to make sure that they know that and they expect it, because you'd be surprised how many times people are like, oh, sorry, I got to go get my wallet. Oh, my wallet's in my car. Oh, my partner took my car to the grocery store. It's amazing how many times that happens in the moment. And the longer that process takes, the more stress there is for the test taker. The other consideration is the technical problems. If your technology doesn't work smoothly, there's going to be points in time where there's inevitably some sort of a technical problem, which really can amplify the stress on the candidate, which means ultimately, even if they get into the test, they might not have the same ability to perform as they did before. So we're thinking about, how do we make it predictable? How do we make it smooth? And on the other side of that, from an internal perspective, we're always looking at the metrics. What's the time it takes test takers to check in? Where do they get stuck? Where do our support tickets get filed? So that internally we can find and assess those and make changes to our platform to remove those or reduce those barriers.
Yeah, you want to be as frictionless as possible, but with also making sure everything's set up. Chris, I'm curious if you have anything to add there about, how to set that balance between user experience and security.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with everything John said. To kind of expand on a bit from a technical perspective, an example is I like what John said about making sure a candidate is prepared and they know what's going to be expected of them. So a security feature that I've really come to find value in is a 2-camera implementation. So when you do security, you always want to make sure you have certain levels. So if they get by one level, you have other things in place that are going to be there to try to catch that. And 2 cameras is a good way to work around those kind of things. But also with regards to user experience, introducing a second camera also introduces another friction point. It's a piece of technology and connection, so it's another point of failure too. So you need to think, so the candidate needs to be prepared, know that they're going to have that, know that they're going to have a device for it, and know that they're going to need to have a spot and how they're going to need to position that, because it's going to be a smaller device. You need a way to put it. Accommodations are also something that I find very interesting from a security perspective. So accessibility software, anything an accessibility software is going to do, all those interfaces it can have are something another a malicious process that somebody could use too. So you don't want to keep the door open completely to accessibility, but you want to make sure that you're offering and making available the accessibility tools to the people that actually need it. So you want to take those things into consideration as well.
So you're saying that if, allowing other programs or other processes to be running for accessibility purposes invites, sort of opens more doors for something to be happening with those,
So-
like someone to take over it?
So processes, yes, but also it's more the fact that those processes are using native APIs with the system. So if you're going to allow those APIs in general, whether it's those processes or a process that's homegrown, those are the things that you need to consider. Should you really be allowing those APIs to interact with your application?
Okay, because it could pose greater risks. Okay.
It can be used for content manipulation, selecting content on the screen. So screen scraping, a lot of those things, anything from interacting to stealing content.
Got it. Thank you, Chris. Pete, I see you have your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that one other element to this is the element of fairness. It's crucial to have policies and procedures in place and to follow those. So if candidate A behaves in one way and ends up getting banned from the program, and candidate B just gets a warning, that news travels very quickly and is very damaging to a program. So the other side of it is, one of the worst things that can happen is to invalidate or ban someone from a program incorrectly. Those accidents happen. So a lot of programs, including ours, have appeals processes at every stage, so that in the 1 in a million chance that someone is incorrectly invalidated or banned from a program, there's the opportunity to go back, take a second look, and make sure that that was done correctly, so that nobody is harmed.
Yeah, I've never thought about that before, the appeals process. How many, you said appeals process at every stage, sort of how many stages is that?
Well, it depends on what the violation is. So if it's a data forensics related invalidation, we have two different appeals processes. Otherwise, if it's an invalidation or a ban from the program, we have one that typically involves us going back and reviewing video, reviewing score similarities, and not only looking at the exam in question, but looking at any other exam that candidate has ever taken with us. So if we can discover a pattern from 6 months or a year ago that carried forward into a suspicious exam, all of that is fair game for our appeals investigations.
That's good to know. All right, well, thank you so much. Next question in this area. I'm curious, and this one I kind of want to go to all panelists, because I am sure you all have some fun stories to share with us. Would like to know some approaches that some, bad actors or misbehaviors, would take to misbehave on a test or steal content. What are some things that you've seen in terms of the range of ways that people can misbehave? Let's start with Harry, and then we'll go around.
So what I'm about to say comes from, the experience of my team investigating this for 500 or so clients. And so the way I start this description always in presentations is, there's a million stories in the naked city. There's lots of different ways that bad guys think to threaten exam content. However, that being said, you can divide those really only into two categories, and it's important to simplify it when you're thinking about it. So for all the different schemes, really the only two things there are proxy testing, which is another person taking the exam for the benefit of the candidate, or content harvesting, where someone is stealing the intellectual property of the exam sponsor so they can sell it or distribute it. Both are significant threats to the exam program. But those are the two broad general categories. And within that, we see all sorts of different attacks. We see technical attacks where some pretty sophisticated folks who have, excellent knowledge of how locked secure browsers work and how, tests are delivered, attempt to threaten those using technology. We also see very simple measures taken where folks understand the limitations of the webcam and the microphone on the, native to the candidate system, and they take steps to avoid that. The techniques are really limited only by the bad guy's imagination, and they definitely respond to our countermeasures. So as we implement a new technique or a new exam security measure, they are already very quickly working on a new way to get around that. And so it's a constant back and forth.
Constantly evolving. Pete, you have your hand up. I think that means you want to answer next.
Actually, I forgot to lower my hand, but I'll give it a shot.
Please go ahead.
For individuals taking online proctored exams, the two most common misbehaviors that we witness are either a third party present in the room or accessing a cell phone. If they are accessing the cell phone, one of two things is happening. They're either researching answers for a test question, or they're harvesting questions by taking photographs with a cell phone. For a third party, it could be as simple as someone standing behind them and indicating this one is answer A, this is answer choice B, this is answer choice C. In some cases, a third party present that is operating the keyboard, or we see very frequently a combination of the two, where a third party is actually photographing the screen and harvesting content. I had one of those last week where the candidate was taking the exam. He had his arms spread aside, and all of a sudden his cell phone creeps up in the between his arm and his chest, and took a picture. I noticed that 25 times in a 50-question exam. So either someone has 3 arms, or there was a third party behind operating there. So that's what we see most frequently.
Wow, that is impressive. Chris, I'll go to you next. Anything else to add here about some I guess innovative approaches that you've seen or heard of?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the hidden camera didn't sound like that last person hit it too well, but hidden camera taking images of the screen. I think another area. So you have the proxy testing, you have the screen scaling content. I also think that there's a kind of a self-help cheating too. And so what I mean by that is figuring out a way to beat the security measures in place in order to just help yourself take the exam. And so an example of that would be you figuring out how to use a virtual machine to get around the secure browser, so that way you can use Google yourself during the exam. So similar like what Pete said with using a phone, but doing it right on the screen, so it's a little less detectable, and working around those ways. I think GPT is really kind of expanding that, because it's while Google, you can eventually get to the answer, your hands are going to have to do a lot of movement, and it's going to be obvious to a proctor that you're doing that. Whereas GPT, you have to do a lot less to get a much better or accurate answer. And then depending on what kind of attacks there are, they could be done as simple as a hot stroke or a hotkey implementation, depending on what the actor can figure out what's allowed and what's not allowed. So when I say GPT, I'm talking about like ChatGPT, those LLMs that are out there, and you ask it a question, it gives you the answer. You can even put in the whole multiple choice question. So figuring out those ways and combining those attacks between content stealing and then just taking that content and moving it right off to the LLM, the ChatGPT, and getting your answer back, and doing those type of things. So I think self-help, I'm referring to it as self-help, but basically giving yourself a way to cheat without needing to involve a third party is also something I've seen out there.
All right, thank you. Definitely lots of different perspectives. John, anything to round us out with this laundry list?
Definitely. And there was a question in Q&A that I answered about ChatGPT and asking if it was something that had really created more incidents of cheating. And I appreciate what you said about that, Chris. Like, people are finding better and better ways to get information out of the exam into any type of an AI model that'll help answer the question and get it back into the exam, and it's getting faster and faster. So instead of people trying to Google the answers, they're using a model like that, which is definitely, it's not really increasing the number of times that people attempt to bypass the rules and look up answers, but it does definitely give them a better tool. It's more likely to give them something accurate as an answer, which is definitely a problem. From our side, as like our proctoring team seems everything. Like, there's funny stories about moms hiding under desks, which gets discovered in the room pan to try and whisper the answers to their kids, to all sorts of shenanigans like that. Sometimes it takes proctors communicating amongst the team and being like, hey, we've seen the same background a few too many times, and identifying proxy testing rings based on their location, because there's not that many cubicles that color on a given day. And so we definitely find that, like Harry said, it's something that's continually evolving. People are always trying to find a new and innovative way to circumvent the rules. And one thing that's so different about testing online is it's a lot more scalable. It's not that scalable to physically go to a test center and take a test for somebody, but it's much more accessible now, in the same way that our tests are more accessible now, which has good and bad.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I think we've just taught the audience a lot about some of the different ways that people try to misbehave. So, Chris, there's one thing that you mentioned earlier that I want to come back to a little bit. You mentioned, I think, in your first answer that a secure browser is not enough. So, can you tell me a little bit more about some of the various tools or technologies in the administrator's toolbox, and why is a secure browser not enough at minimum?
Yeah, so yeah, I definitely do not think a secure browser is enough. There's a lot of layers that need to be put in when you're putting together a security implementation. I do really like the 2-camera option. I recognize it doesn't make sense for everybody. It adds more friction in certain points, so it's not something you always want to use, but it is a useful tool if it makes sense for you and it's something that can work for your program. There's different levels of proctoring too that can be implemented. So you can have like live real-time proctors, professional proctors, or more with like the Proctor Now solutions. You can have like you bring your own proctor or like a record and review or a hybrid model where really the candidate doesn't really know if they're being live proctored or not, but you have the tools in place and you can come and review after the fact. And AI notifications are also a useful tool too, with regards to proctoring and helping out and just improving the efficiency of the proctor. Secure browsers are definitely interesting. There's a whole bunch of different ones out there. I think with regards to remote proctoring, you really need to use an application-based lockdown browser. And so when I say secure browser or lockdown browser, what I'm talking about is an application that can lock down the machine and only allow access to the applications and the content that should be taken during the exam. So that way you can't use other things during the exam. There's different levels of it, but really it's a program at the end of the day. And so a secure browser, in my opinion, can be beat. If there's somebody determined enough out there and they have the time and the resources and the motivation to do it, they will find a way. And so it's something that it's an area that you constantly have to be vigilant in, constantly have to be watching for new attacks out there and providing the updates. The secure browser, it's so much more than just looking for processes these days. It used to be housed behind a testing center with trusted admins and those type of things. But in the remote world, those days are long gone. People now have access to the software. They can download it because they need to. And so you need to take extra steps that didn't have to be taken before. You need to make sure that these attackers trying to use the secure browser can't get like unlimited attempts to try to figure out a solution. You need to make sure that you're applying security in a smart way. You need to make sure that you're not only looking for processes, but you're looking at the operating system holistically. Every API and every interface that the secure browser is using is something else another application can do. So you need to monitor these things. You need to watch for process hijacking and those type of things. So it's really just a gamut. And at the end of the day, when you consider all those things together, it just makes it so secure browser is a very good tool and something you should have, but it should not be the only tool in the toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. John, would you like to add?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's 2 questions in the Q&A that really kind of tie into this. One asking about how do you totally secure an environment, and then the other, how effective secure browsers are at detecting processes. And I think the important thing to realize is there's no complete single solution. We can never perfectly secure an environment. What we have to do is go back to that original plan and strategy for your exam and determine how much risk you can afford. What's the right way based on the based on the exam and your goals, what's the right level of security to introduce the right amount of friction to balance your security and user experience goals? So there isn't perfect solutions, and it's always going to be an iterative process as we introduce new countermeasures. Harry said this exactly right. Like, we'll introduce a new countermeasure, there'll be a new response to it, and that's going to be continuous forever. The key is that you set goals for your program that make sense, so that you know how you're going to respond if it happens. You understand that you put the right kind of set of protections into place based on the significance of the exam, and do your best to monitor the data that comes back so you can make adjustments over time.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So last question about that pertains to sort of during the exam here. We mentioned this a little bit earlier about some of the distractions coming in the room, and some things that are a little bit out of your control, right? Some things may be common, like a child or a pet or something entering the room. But, curious from your perspective, what's sort of like that allowable threshold for those distractions? This kind of plays into that, user friendliness versus security as well. How do you make that determination? John, anything to add to that? Or any thoughts on that question?
I got distracted reading one of the questions. I think you could ask again. I'm
That's
sorry.
okay. No, it's okay. We talked about, the candidate controls the environment, distractions may be common. What's the allowable threshold for allowing those distractions before an exam's terminated?
Yeah, I think that there needs to be a really specific choice made by the program ahead of time. And what I mean by that is you need to think about how high stakes the exam is. And we generally approach that with kind of packaging it into general default things of, is this something that is a strict exam or a more balanced exam? And what we will do with that is determine what threshold it is where, for example, if a child walks into the room, there are certain programs that choose to terminate an exam at that point because of that violation. And so our goal is to have a suite of tools that a program can use to customize what level they want based on their needs. So from our perspective, we have to have a wide range of that, but it's really down to the program to determine what's most appropriate. And there's definitely not a single size that fits all.
Mm-hmm. Pete, anything to add to that?
Yeah, to add to that, it has to be iterative. At Amazon, we used to have a very hard line. Any third party in the testing area equaled invalidation of the exam and termination of the exam. And then we realized that there are some circumstances where a toddler walks in to say hi to daddy or mom, or you've got somebody in the far background that opens the door, realizes that somebody's taking an exam and leaves without interacting whatsoever with a candidate. It was grossly unfair to just automatically terminate those exams and require somebody to pay a fee for testing again. So we back down on that a little bit. And obviously, if a child enters, we're assuming that they're not giving any pre-knowledge of test questions, but also we provide 2 warnings for that before we terminate an exam.
Mm-hmm. Well, stricter balanced exam, needing it to be iterative. I think those all sound like really good approaches to make that decision for your program. All right, so let's move into the final sort of phase here, talking about what you should be doing after the testing happens. So I'm going to kick it off. Pete, I know you just talked, but I'm curious for your thoughts on this one. Tell me about what post-analysis steps should every testing program be doing?
Thank you. I really think that all depends on how well funded your exam program is. If you have a relatively small scope program and you're presenting 500 or 1,000 exams a year, you may not have funding to do things like full-blown data forensics and statistical analysis. In that case, just some basic score analysis. So looking at it, if the typical candidate for this particular exam takes 45 minutes to complete an exam, and you have somebody that completed it in 6 minutes and 30 seconds, that might be a red flag that this is something worth looking at. If you're well funded, you have a higher scope program, and you're delivering tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of exams a year, then you may have the fortune of having a team that can look at data forensics, looking at score similarities, looking at all those different elements to determine whether or not misbehavior is occurring that way.
Mm-hmm. Harry, wonder if you have anything to add to that.
I do. Just to quote another one of our clients, and that's something I'll put in a pitch for here. We conduct investigations jointly with our clients. We learn from them and they learn from us. And so when I get to this later, I'll talk about joint investigations. I think another question is more appropriate to that. But the reason I'm quoting our clients so much is because we learn from them. And so this quote is, you really cannot abdicate responsibility for the security of your own program. And by that, what this client meant is somebody at the exam sponsor has to be looking at results. And Pete, I think, did a good job of explaining, based on resources, maybe it's a whole psychometrics team that can do forensics and very detailed analysis. Maybe it's just one person based on the size of the program who has other roles and responsibilities. but who also has as one of their collateral duties security. But somebody has to be flying the security airplane and monitoring it. And sadly, we do see clients where 3 or 4 people share that responsibility, and inevitably those are the programs where sometimes the ball is dropped, or no one's watching for periods of months or even years. And so it's important, whatever level of scrutiny that you do, that someone does it. And I will also add one other technique, in addition to forensics, is a tip line. To quote a client, if you don't have a tip line, then you are blind to the exam security threats that your program faces. And so it's important that you have a capability, and it doesn't have to be a manned telephone. It can be an email, but your candidates are out there seeing what their colleagues are doing and what other people in their position are doing. Oftentimes they want to report misconduct themselves because, of course, they share your interest in keeping the program safe. The honest candidates always do. And so in addition to forensics and looking at scores, you also have to have a way for someone outside the company to be able to report to you if they see something bad happening. So tip line.
Tip line. Okay. We've already touched this a little bit, but I do want to just make sure that we call out, what is the balance between failing someone or allowing them to pass if you think that they are misbehaving? Where do you draw that line? And I assume that we're going to say it sort of depends, but kind of curious what some of those decision factors are. John, I'm wondering if you could say a few words on that.
There's definitely a few key factors. I think really thinking about the way to secure the environment, the pieces that come into that, it's again putting the layers in place that you have to have, not leaving it until the moment that you're just launching an exam or a new version, to make sure that you've thought about the continuums. And there was a question in the QA about what layers go into the environment, and it's got to be clear rules, clear responses to those rules. We typically rely on tactics like room pads and other things, sometimes even partway through the exam, to re-secure if there's an anomaly or something that might kind of cause us to question the situation. Those are kind of the top of mind for me.
Mm-hmm. And Pete, anything to add to that?
Well, I think it also has something to do with severity of offense and provability of offense. So if I wanted to scan a document that I have on my iPhone, I would place that outside of a webcam view. And the only way I'm going to be able to access that is if I'm consistently looking to the side to see what's on that smartphone. In that case, the first time somebody looks off screen, we issue a warning and let them know that continuing that can result in termination of the exam. The second time we get a second warning. Third time they do it, it's invalidated. Now the proof side of that is we can't see from our webcam recording what exactly it is that they're looking at. We know it's a device or it's perhaps notes, but we don't know for certain that they are notes about the exam. Now, if somebody leaves webcam view for 5-6 seconds and then comes back, or decides that they want a bathroom break, even though we don't offer those for our exams, and comes back a minute and a half later, that's an automatic violation and termination of the exam, because who knows what they were doing during that minute and a half, if they were cribbing up on answers for a question that they're having a difficult time answering, or what the case might be. So provability does definitely play a role in this.
Mm-hmm.
And is it fair to say, Pete, a lot of it comes down to indicators? Like, we're looking for indicators of potential problems. And it's funny because I think about this a lot. In my office, I've got a big window to my right and people walk their dogs by all the time. And I'm always like, ooh, who's walking by? What's going on? Like, I look out there a lot and I think about, if I was in this environment in a test, at what point in time would my natural habits get me in trouble with that? And so part of it is there may be a completely innocent reason. And that's why we really push on the way we flag and talk about events is what's the indicators? What's a potential event? Like, we're trying to be very careful about how we couch that, because we provide data to a program so they can make a judgment call. But there might be an excuse, you never really know. But if there's enough indicators, chances are it might also not be innocent. And so you've got to be watching and thinking about how to interpret that data, because you can never have the full story.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. All right, so Harry, want to chat with you for a minute about major misconduct. This is one of your major areas of focus. So what are some signs that major misconduct is afoot and it's not just a one-off, and what are some indicators that a more in-depth investigation may be warranted?
So I think we the way I characterize the way we do intake of investigations is we are not shy and we're not proud. We'll take information from anywhere as long as it's truthful and it's accurate, it's verifiable. So we will take lead information for major misconduct from literally anyone as long as we can prove that the information is accurate. Sources that we will typically draw on, we have informants that we've recruited over time who are reporting to us what the bad guys are doing. We use tiplines. Both Pearson VUE we have our own tipline, and then our clients almost all have robust tipline capabilities, and so we'll take it that way. We also rely heavily on forensics, right? If our psychometric teams are telling us there's a problem, or because of joint investigations with our clients psychometric teams are telling us there's an issue, then we will look there. And typically it doesn't start as a major problem, right? If one person out there, one colleague of a candidate says, hey, this guy sits in the next cubicle and I heard that he's cheating. I heard he had someone take his exam. We'll gather all the information from that tipster, from that person, and maybe it'll turn into a major investigation because we'll recognize that the technique is one used by dozens or hundreds of candidates. So again, it really depends where we get the information from. We look at everything, at least on the VUE special investigations team, as having the potential for being a large scale threat, because oftentimes many of them are. And then what we do with that information is also, I think, significant. So I'll just take a second to talk about it. In addition to sharing it with our clients so they can take remedial action and handle the candidate misconduct, we also share it with our internal teams. We are very aggressive at pushing techniques that we see, what the bad guys are doing, to our development teams so that they can implement their own countermeasures to stop them. And so we talk with the product owners, in this case, the OnVUE product owners, on a daily, sometimes hourly basis, so they can build a higher wall.
Mm-hmm. Last question here. How often would you guys say a new technique pops up, and how do you find out about it? I'll start with Chris quickly. How often would you say you're seeing new techniques to respond to?
Yeah, I think it's more driven by just what the market is, how valuable that is, and what workarounds have what security has the wall gotten higher recently. Every time the wall gets higher, it's going to get they're going to come up with a new way to get around that. And so there's certainly even at a very high easy level that somebody's not very experienced with computers, you can easily find a website that's out there selling some of the attacks that I mentioned earlier in the form of software. And so those things are constantly popping up. Every time you implement a measure, it pretty much, you're starting a stopwatch for somebody to try to figure that out, if there's value in figuring it out.
Got it. Thank you. Harry, in a couple seconds, anything else to add to that about how often these pop up?
No, it's I think Chris covered it. It's not super often. The bad guys evolve for sure in response to what we're doing, but it's not hour by hour or minute by minute. I mean, it takes them a while to figure out what we're doing and then to develop procedures. There was a big one earlier this year where they invented a whole new way of doing proxy testing. But I'd say only one or two major new techniques a year, by and large. Great.
All right, last presenter question before we grab some of the questions from the Q&A. I appreciate that you guys have been answering sort of in writing throughout. Just a couple of seconds, I want to go around the table. Where do you think we'll be in 1 to 2 years with regards to remote proctoring? Pete, I'm going to start with you.
I think both proxy testers and misbehaving candidates and test delivery providers are going to be using AI and machine learning a lot more than we're using now. The big the big detractors for both of those right now are things like GDPR and requirements and restrictions outside of the United States, and the fact that these programs are still in their infant stage, don't work very well, and are incredibly slow. But once they speed up and are real time as opposed to long pauses between prompts and answers, I think we're going to be in trouble.
All right, Chris, you're next on my list. Anything, any insights, predictions to add?
I think I do think that we'll see probably more record and review from a proctoring standpoint. From a bad actor standpoint, I think it will be the same but different. I think they'll find new ways, but the same people trying to do it will still be trying to do it. If there's money there, they're going to be looking for that money. Something I am interested to see is what is AI going to be used to help? Well, I know it is going to be used, but like, how is AI going to really make them improve the frequency of their attack? Is it going to increase the frequency of their attacks? Because AI, not only is it beneficial, but it also can be used to make development and those type of things easier as well.
Mm-hmm. Harry, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say, I wanted to add this earlier, but then we moved past it. The real benefit of AI to the bad guys so far that we've been able to see is it reduces their need for experts. And what I mean by that is, if I set up a proxy business, running it out of my house, and I want to test on 5 different exam programs, I want to test AWS because Pete's here, and I want to test 3 or 4 other exam programs, chances are I can't, Harry can't pass all of those exams himself. So he has to, I have to go out and get experts. I have to get, my wife can maybe pass an exam, and then my next door neighbor can pass an exam. And then the coordination of scheduling all those folks and making those remote access proxy tests happen. What ChatGPT and the large learning models allow these proxy testers to do is dispense with those experts. Because as Chris described it, you can type in a portion of the question and ChatGPT will give you a reasonable answer that would let you take answer the question. And so ChatGPT is really streamlining, at least has the potential to really streamline how these remote access proxy organizations do business.
Definitely. All right, John, last prediction.
I think that you'll continue to see AI used more and more on both sides, absolutely. And if you think about, especially from the certification perspective, a lot of what we're trying to do is help people demonstrate skills. I imagine we'll get to a point soon where AI is able to evaluate someone's performance. So if you think about performance-based testing and some of those things, it's a great way to demonstrate. Like, it's one thing to say I know the answers to an AWS exam. It's another thing to say I know how to set up an EC2 cluster. And one of the things that is going to change, I think, will be our ability to evaluate responses. So I would imagine that we'll start to see AI being able to evaluate our performance of a task, our response, something that's not just based on evaluating question and answers. And we've already seen it becoming much more able to understand big blocks of language like essay answers and the like. So I think it's going to be incredibly amazing from a learning perspective. I think as humans, it's going to change the way that we access information in an extreme way, just like the internet did. And all of a sudden, information's at our fingertips. Well, now it'll be more digestible and more consumable. So I think it's going to be really exciting, and there's going to be endless amounts of work for us to do to keep testing secure and fair. And I'm excited about it.
Great, thank you. Oh my goodness, we are at time, more or less. I see, in looking at the questions and answers that are here now, like I said, thank you so much for the panelists for answering those questions live. I believe we can share the Q&As after. We will have a sort of a post-webinar email going out. I'll open it up to the panelists for, the most upvoted question in here is about, when someone's caught with misconduct, how much information is provided and the details of their misconduct. Does anyone want to attempt an answer at that? Maybe Pete or John, you just came off mute.
I was just going to go on mute. I think probably Harry and Pete have the best. We provide a lot of data, but we don't usually make those judgment calls.
All right, Harry, since you came off mute, let us.
To John's point, we never make those judgment calls. So, a famous quote from J. Edgar Hoover, of the FBI is, the FBI is in fact gathering information. We don't we don't judge guilt or innocence. We provide the facts. That's exactly how this team operates. We provide all of the facts that are available to the client, and then they compare them to their hundreds of different policies and procedures, and they make the decision on, adjudication. Sometimes they'll ask us what are other clients in the space doing, or what's an industry best practice, but we never make a decision. We will occasionally make recommendations, but our primary role is providing facts to people like Pete, and then they make the decision.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We are at time right now. I want to once again thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. I think we all learned a lot. Like I said, you should be getting a follow-up email with a recording. We'll see what we can do about the Q&As, the questions that have been answered, and don't click away too fast for the survey. So thank you all once again. Bye.
Thank you.